Stand by.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation. Today, we're going to cover compensation, a regular compensation. What pay is retirement eligible? So, first, on behalf of our board and our executive director, thank you for joining us today. We're going to cover multiple aspects of compensation. We'll talk about the training and some other stuff. So hopefully we can get started soon. One thing I did want to point out just before we get started, if you look inside the chat, there is a link to a handout with all of today's slides. If you want to print it out, there's a little area for notes. So that's available to you if you just want to print that out in case you want something to take notes on. Hopefully you'll get it printed out by the time we're through the agenda and that sort of stuff. And, just in case you find that helpful. So today's agenda. First, we're going to just quickly touch on the training program overall. Then we're going to talk about the statutory of regular compensation. Excuse me, the statutory definition of regular compensation, contracts and regular comp, base pay and other compensation, and then the annual regular compensation cap. All right. So through the summer, this might be the first session you're attending, or you might have gone to all of these sessions, but we've been going through different sessions as, with different topics. And what we're doing is sort of slowly building towards deduction reporting. And so if you've not attended any of the previous programs, please note we have them all available on our website for download. For those of you who are downloading the videos, just so you know, this is video number 5. But technically, not everyone has to do both versions of the eligibility. So in theory, this is session number 4, somebody who would be attending. So as you can see here, we have the previous ones listed in order and then grayed out. And here we are on the third to last. So we've got this one and 2 more on deduction reporting, and hopefully folks are finding these sessions helpful. All right. So with that, try to give you enough time to print your slides if you need to. Let's get started. So, first, regular compensation. The term regular compensation is defined in Mass General Law, Chapter 32, Section 1, with all the definitions. Okay, and in the statute, if you were to look up regular compensation, you'll find that over time it evolved. Most recently in 2009. And what you'll see is, as it evolved and the different definitions were placed in there and the changes were placed, each one has sort of a, okay, as of this date, this is when it becomes effective. So for today's training, we're only going to concentrate on regular compensation effective July 1st, 2009. Say it's pretty safe to say we don't have anybody that's going to retire today that uses those old definitions. Having said that, if there really is somebody who's going to retire today and they left service, say in 2006, those rules would apply to them. So obviously we're aware of those as well.
Hi,
So,
Bobby.
yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. It doesn't look like your slides are forwarding on the presentation.
Oh, that's really strange. Okay.
Can you maybe stop and restart sharing?
Yep.
There we go. Now we see it.
Pardon me. I did not realize they weren't moving. I'm not sure how that happened. Okay. So let me just quickly catch people up where we were. I apologize. So again, today we're going to go through the training sessions, right? The definition of regular comp, contracts and regular compensation, base pay and other compensation, and then the regular compensation cap. I mentioned quickly the different training sessions we're doing. So intro to MTRS. These are all the different programs we have already implemented. You can see they're grayed out. And again, for anyone joining us for the first time via the videos that'll be loaded on our site, this will be the 4th one you'd want to attend because most folks, I don't think you'd do both versions of the membership eligibility. So we had the introduction, membership eligibility, creditable service, and now we're doing regular compensation. And that'll bring me back to the slide I was just covering, which is the definition of regular compensation. So again, this is the term in the statute that sets up what pay is retirement eligible. So this is the definition of what you can include in your compensation when you apply for retirement, and what therefore earnings should have MTRS deductions taken on them. Okay. Now, Again, the definition of regular compensation has changed over the years. It's subject to case law changes, of course, if the legislature has decided we're interpreting something wrong or something of that nature. Excuse me, the courts decide that, or if the legislature has reviewed regular compensation, decide they need to make a change to the statute. They've done that a couple of times, but the most recent time was with pension reform back in 2009. So today we're going to cover from 2009 on. And what you'll see is the definition of regular compensation is actually simpler than it's ever been in a way, in the sense that the actual definition just says anything after 2009, reg comp shall be exclusively as wages by an employee for service performed in the employment for his employer. So that took some things out back in 2009. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. And we're going to show you some other references. Pardon me. So now you might think to yourself, well, I knew what wages were. Well, wages in the regular comp law very specifically points to another definition in Chapter 32 for the term wages. Now, I can't put the entire definition on a slide. It's 325 words long, and it's got 2,134 characters. It just doesn't fit. And I didn't want to give you 6 slides of a continuing definition. So if you'd like to look up the very specific law, I've given you a link directly to the law, to the section of the laws where you can find the term alphabetically for wages, if for some reason you want to look up the very specific definition. Now, in this training session, we're going to do our best to attempt to define wages for you, okay, and explain basically what's going to be retirement eligible and what's not going to be retirement eligible. So, one last thing. One last thing I just want to mention with the definitions that go through, please know that everything we're covering today is what we know as of today, right? So if there's a big court case, some sort of evaluation, it is always possible that we will learn, possibly with employers, that some sort of interpretation of what's in the statute in accordance with the courts, that we need to do things a little differently. So everything we have is as of today. I'm not aware of any changes that are on the horizon or anything of that nature, but it's such a complicated matter that it is possible, and we've seen that in the past. So with that, we'll cover what we know at least for the first 15 years, which I think is a pretty good sample. So when talking about regular compensation, contract structure really matters. Excuse me. And so if you have an employee who's covered by a collective bargaining agreement, any payment to that employee must be in the collective bargaining agreement to be considered regular compensation. Now, please keep in mind, bargaining with your folks outside of their collective bargaining agreement is a federal issue too. This isn't just an MTRS rule. Another thing that's important is that once your contract expires, it cannot be legally amended. This is not an MTRS rule. This is contract law. So that's a very important thing to know and to understand. Side agreements outside of a collective bargaining agreement with employees who are covered by a CBA is also not allowed. Again, this isn't exclusively an MTRS thing. If you think about, there was a case a few years ago with United Auto Workers where a major auto company got caught making side agreements with union reps and basically bribing them to take a better contract. So that's what these laws are designed to prevent. Okay, now nobody's of course accusing schools of this, but it's important that you're working within the framework of how contracts work. Make sure that you have a good understanding of those rules. Okay, now if you have an employee who transitions from one bargaining unit to another, so let's say they go from being a Unit A teacher and they become a Unit B administrator. So maybe they've been a teacher for years and they've moved over, right? Now, while they're in Unit A, let's say they were doing some kind of extra duty. They were also serving as the head of the math department. Okay. Well, when they transition into be a Unit B member, maybe an assistant principal or something, the school district might think, okay, well, we'd still like you to be the head of the math department while you're doing these new duties. Well, if the person is either in an individual contract or they're in another unit, they're no longer a member of the Unit A contract, right? So that extra duty either has to follow them into their individual contract, or in the Unit B contract, there has to be some sort of mechanism that very specifically allows Unit B members to be eligible for Unit A stipends. There's nothing wrong with that. You can have a Unit B contract, and it says all of our Unit B, folks, they're going to be eligible for Unit A stipends, or they're going to be eligible for Unit A longevity, or for longevity as explained in Unit A Amendment 4 or Appendix 6, something like that. And that's perfectly okay, because you might have spent a lot of time negotiating some of these additional items, and so you don't want to have to do it twice, right? I mean, that's perfectly okay, but the other contract has to refer to it. Otherwise, the payment's non-contractual and it's not going to be retirement eligible, even if they did it for years. So that's a very important thing to make sure you understand. Now, another situation where we can see that sometimes comes up when people are sort of, trying to fill holes. Folks are getting creative to try and fill a need, right? You might have an employee who's covered by a collective bargaining agreement, and now they're asked to do something above and beyond. So maybe something outside the collective bargaining agreement. They're going to be covering another role. Hey, we'll give you, $123 a day if you cover this role. Okay. Well, they're covered by a collective bargaining agreement. So if they're going to stay a part of that union and stay a part of that collective bargaining agreement, that contract needs to include that kind of a provision. And so you can't just say, well, they're already my employee, I'll just drop a little side agreement. They're going to cover us for 62 days in this other role. That's not a thing. You got to be very careful. Now if your collective bargaining agreement allows for a daily payment, for instance, if someone's going to be called, asked to be a stand-in administrator or something along those lines, there are ways where your contract will allow for that. But you need to make sure that your collective bargaining agreement has that sort of dynamic piece to it, or that you make an amendment to your contract while it's still active to sort of take care of that. Now, if the employee is being placed in a supervisory role, might cause a little bit of a conflict if they're in the union, right? How do they supervise somebody? Technically, they're under the supervision of the union in a way, right? So you might want to think about that too. And, if you're pulling out one of your tenured teachers and they're going to be an assistant principal for a while, they might need their own contract for the autonomy, right? I mean, this might be something that you really need to think long and hard about, just giving them a separate contract. The paperwork matters. If you just try to pay somebody some off-contract stipend, and we're going to talk about, what things are ineligible or eligible, ineligible, but you're going to see for multiple reasons, we're going to exclude that. And we're trying to be as uniform and as, objective as possible. But we want to, avoid at all costs as being subjective, right? So we're trying to be as uniform with everybody, and that could, even if the situation looks like it would otherwise be fine, you have to make sure you're following all the right practices with contracts. Now, pay for additional compensation must be in a member's employment contract to be considered regular compensation. And we're going to talk about base pay versus additional pay in a few minutes, but I want to make sure we covered the contract part first, right? Because you might be thinking to yourself, like, oh, no, it's no problem. We have these folks that they're on our teachers agreement. We're going to create this new club and we're going to give them a side letter. It'll be fine. But you're going to find out that's going to be a problem, right? That you can't deal with them outside. So you're going to find that for your administrators, your best practice is to always just put everything in their contract, okay? And make sure that it's spelled out. The idea of what's retirement eligible is ultimately what's regular compensation. So regular compensation means it happens regularly. So there should be no surprise that what we're looking for is that consistency or that regularity to how they're paid. Now, one other important thing, because this can be a little misleading, which is that existing in the contract alone doesn't automatically make it eligible. Sometimes folks are like, oh yeah, we've got this payment and they're doing this. Oh, no, it's in the contract. And we're like, okay, it's out for like 5 other reasons, but in the contract is usually a good step one, but it's not the end all be all. Okay, we're gonna cover some of those other rules, I promise, before the session's over. But please just know going into this that being in the contract is required, but it's not the only requirement to making something eligible. Now, payments for services that aren't really specific. So, I remember there was one district that once called their thing, called some of their stipends the 40-hour club. I know we've recently gotten one called a duty stipend. We've seen Club A, Club B stipends, or, Activity A, Activity B. And the idea here is you're just creating a pool, right? And so it's going to be a kind of stipend. And then later on, you can just kind of fill in the blank, right? Well, again, regular compensation has a requirement there that it's going to be duty for services and that it's regular in nature, right? So it has to be identifiable. And so if you put in a payment that we can't recognize that as additional duties, if you have a label in there, we're not quite sure what the person did. Did they even provide additional duties? I don't know. You may as well make your label retirement stuff. This is the MTRB stuff stipend, right? We can't allow for that. Now, in some cases, it doesn't have to be, say, math department chair in the Smith Middle School, room 12, right? It doesn't have to be that specific either. But it has to have enough containment and labeling so that we know exactly what the person did. So if you tell someone's a department head, we know what that means. Now, you might have multiple department heads, but if they're all getting paid the same stipend, we know what a department head is, and it's identifiable, it's verifiable, and we can prove the person provided an extra service for it. And that's the kind of thing where you want to strike a balance, okay? Now, you might think to yourself, well, this is the thing. We had this many clubs this year, but next year, we don't know if anybody's going to want to be in the hiking club. And I don't want to have a hiking club in our contract and nobody has signed up for it or something. I think what you want to look for there is some kind of a mechanism where you can be specific, but maybe not corner yourself in too much. You can also file an amendment if you feel, with your union, or have some sort of a deadline to say, okay, in our contract, as of August 12th, we're going to have 12, different stipends here, or 12 different clubs. We're going to see, or even by October 12th, we're going to have 12 different clubs. We're going to see what the student sign-up rate looks like, and the 12 that have the most sign-in, we're going to do them, and this is the pool that they'll come out of or something. Maybe there's 20 in the list. There are ways that you can do it that still give you some flexibility, but are clearly going to be something that's paid in the contract and it's specific. So you just got to be careful with that. Now, as far as other things, within the contract itself, right? So payments to folks that are outside the mission of the school. This isn't the exclusive list, but these are a couple that I could think of that are situations where their programs kind of run with the schools, but they're not really the school being the school, right? So an adult ed program hosted in the schools, it allows students from outside the district, maybe adults, and the curriculum does not lead towards a diploma. So there's sort of two versions of night school that can happen. Virtual school is kind of removing the need for night school in some ways, which is really good. And there's a couple virtual schools that people can sign up Commonwealth-wide. But having said that, there are a couple of communities that had night schools, right? And maybe, for high schools, you could have somebody with maybe a sick family member and they need to be home during the day. And so the kid can go to school at night to get a diploma. There might be, I know people have mentioned teenage pregnancy before as possibly being a thing, or some sort of other healthcare situation. So again, hopefully virtual schools have really taken the burden off of that. But if you have a program where it's for your kids, everybody there is a licensed teacher. It's just basically day school that happens at night, and they're going to get a diploma. We'll happily review that just to make sure it's retirement eligible. I know I can think of two programs at least that existed at one point. I don't want to mention them because they might not be true anymore. But if you're running, if your school district's running a program where maybe it's, and I'm not saying that these programs don't have a good purpose, they're just not K through 12 day schools, right? So it would be outside of the sort of the mission of the schools, right? Daycare programs are another example. Or for instance, you have a school employee and they're being employed to do something else outside of the schools, right? So our example, this is a real one, a gym teacher who is being paid to go in on Saturdays to open the pool for the community. So it's not for the school kids, it's everyone in the community. Is there anything wrong with that? Of course there isn't. But it's not regular compensation for the purpose of being the gym teacher. They're filling a completely different role, which you could argue is a town role, right? So that would not be considered regular compensation because it's happening outside of the mission of the school. Payments for programs outside of the school year are also not eligible, right? So that's almost going to be exclusively the summer, not necessarily exclusively the summer, but almost always. So, a couple examples of that. Summer school is one, and that went all the way to the Superior Court, and we have a decision on that from years ago. We also have summer camps that are starting to pop up. Again, not bad programs, but they're outside of the school being the school. This is stuff that's happening during the summer, and summer school was excluded. Gosh, I think at this point it's like 30 or 40 years ago. So that that's something that's held up through the test of time, if you will. So so again, most programs aren't affected by this, but just a little more rare, but something to make sure you take in consideration. If you think you have a program that might be operating a little bit outside of the school and you want to kind of check with us, please, let us know. Obviously, gather some documents and we can look at it with you. And then one last slide for this section, then we'll see if we have any questions in chat. So contractual things to consider, right? So we talked about a little bit of this so far. And first and foremost, evaluate your contracts carefully. Think about these rules. You got to understand these rules when you're negotiating with employees. Nobody wants to express something to an employee, then find out afterwards, oh, geez, we didn't know it worked that way, right? Express all compensation in writing, and then say what you mean and mean what you say. Don't make something look like it's a stipend if it's an hourly pay. Don't make something look like hourly pay that's a stipend. Things like that. If you have questions on a particular payment, please make sure you have the actual contractual language when you're reaching out to the MTRS. That's super important. If you call us up and you're like, hey, we're thinking about doing this MOA on a thing. We're going to do an amendment over our contract. What do you think? Well, I can't think anything. I don't have any contractual language, and how you structure it could make all the difference in the world. So, your employer services rep will basically just have to say, I need to see the language, and I can't really give you any kind of help. And the other thing is, if we do look at something that has been drafted, the only answer we can give you is if that wording remains exactly how you gave it to us. So if you give us wording and then somebody goes back and tweaks it, that tweak, could be the death tweak, if you will. So please make sure you're giving us the best version. And then if you make changes and if you want it reevaluated, you're going to run it by us again. Okay. If you're submitting an entire CBA because you have questions on something, we will not just read your entire CBA and say, hey, this is all the stuff that's regular compensation. Your school district's history with us, you should have a general idea. Now, having said that, you might send us a CBA. You say, all right, I've got the whole CBA. I've got a question on XYZ. Okay, so please make sure you're telling us what page it's on, what section it's in. We cover over 400 school districts. You have one collective bargaining agreement, maybe two if you have a couple different units. Please tell us where it is and where we can find what you're looking for. We don't want to send people on wild goose chases. We need them doing deduction reports. Please make sure all your types of pay are properly coded in your payroll system and that your payroll staff understand the codes. So the best label, the better you can have labels in your payroll system, the better you can kind of match up your payroll system to the way your contract works. We'll kind of put everybody in a position to be successful, and that's what we all want, okay? And when you execute collective bargaining agreements, please send a copy to your assigned employer services rep here at the MTRS. We post them to a directory so that hopefully if we get retirement applications, that kind of stuff, if member services has a question, we can make them all available. The good folks in communications maintain that for us. We send them over to them. They really do all the hard work. But it allows us to share that information. And then, many years from now, if you have somebody who's retiring and they're retiring 8 years after they leave service, hopefully we'll have that built up archive, right? And so we won't have to, send someone looking through archives to find their old contracts. So again, please send them to us as you execute them. We'll store them, and it allows us to do some better salary checks and other things on the payroll side too. So, all right. Now, I'm just wondering, we're about to switch into sort of a different topic. So do we have any questions in the chat, Scott?
We do have one. The
Cool.
question is, does regularly mean same number of hours, or can hours differ weekly?
That is a fantastic question. It is such a good question. I'm going to cover it in about 3 slides. So let me catch up to you on that one, but I promise we will touch on that. But it is a good question. And that was the only one, right?
That's all we have. Yep.
Cool. Okay. So now we're going to get into pay. And I do promise whoever asked that question, you will get your answer. So we're going to start with base pay. So pay received for one's primary job is always regular compensation. Now, I'm presuming here that the person's MTRS eligible, right? And if you're not sure, we did that training as training number 2. So go back and check that one out. But if the person is MTRS eligible, the pay they receive for their primary job is always regular compensation. The method of calculating the pay, because it's their primary job, it doesn't matter if it's hourly, weekly, monthly, etc. See, I'm already touching on the hourly thing. So for base pay, for instance, MTRS employees, the non-management staff are hourly, right? So technically, we tally their hours, we send them to the state employees retirement system. They're covered by the same law, and that's okay because it's their base pay. It's their primary employment. Okay. Now, obviously, or if not obvious, please report this as base earnings. And just a quick reminder, because I always do this if I have the opportunity, don't forget that in your reports, your salary should always be the full year full-time salary. Okay. So I think base pay is pretty simple. We're not going to spend too long on base pay. Let's go on to additional pay, because this is where it gets a little squirrely. So the first pay that we're going to talk about here is additional days. So additional days must be must be authorized in a member's contract, whether it's individual or CBA. Now, I would think if you have an individual contract, it's just going to say your number of days. So doing extra days in an individual contract is a little weird, because if you're required to work them, why is in your contract to say you're going to do that number of days? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I've seen it before. Now, in collective bargaining agreements, you're obviously covering a much bigger pool of people, and there might be a small group of people in the middle there that have to do some extra days. My go-to example is your guidance staff. Sometimes it's department heads. So please make sure that your contractual language, that your contract has good contractual language that covers the extra days. Some of the best ones, we'll talk about that in just a minute at the end bullet, but great language requires almost no verification, right? So the duties for the extra days have to be the same as the person's primary job. So if you have somebody who's working as a teacher for the first, 10 months, and then in July they have this whole different job that they do for 2 weeks, no, that's not gonna fly, right? Now, you can have people. So guidance staff is again my go-to example on this. Department heads might be another good one. Technically, they're performing their main job, but a couple of the duties they do is a little different, right? They're making sure all the kids who should have passed their classes, whether they should or should not advance to the next grade, things like that. Did someone qualify maybe to be in an AP class? All that sort of stuff that guidance counselors do at the end of a school year, at the beginning of the year, people who transfer in and out of a district. I'm not a guidance counselor, so that's about as much about that as I know, but they're clearly doing guidance counselor work. Okay, that's the key. Department heads, maybe they're trying to get rid of that crazy math teacher. Just kidding. But they're still doing department head work. That's going to be the key to those extra days being eligible. Now, if you have them come in and you're like, oh yeah, no, we're paying all our middle school teachers. This is a great cost saver. They're going to paint their own classroom. No, that's not retirement eligible. I don't know why you'd pay your teachers to do your painting, but and I'm not even saying that that's not their thing, but that's not going to be the same. If they're doing other kinds of workshops and stuff, it can get a little gray. I mean, really, they have to be doing something that is, really core to their main job. Okay. So if the duties slightly differ because of the time of year, again, guidance counselors are a great example. They're doing guidance counselor work. It's a slightly different guidance counselor work. We're not going to question that as long as it's properly in the contract. All right. Now, if the contract is not explicit about the number of days they're going to work, right? It's like, I mean, they might have to do up to 6. Okay, so at that point, up to became kind of shady, right? Shady is not, that's called flexible, questionably flexible. So in that case, we are going to require some sort of a notification from the superintendent generally, or possibly a principal saying, oh yeah, no, I know we have a little flexibility in our contract, but we needed Jane here because, we needed her here for the full allotment. With everything going on with COVID, we had things going crazy, people are changing, the years are kind of all morphed together. We needed her here for all 6 of those days. Okay, and that's going to be all right. Now, please keep in mind, though, just because you have a letter from the superintendent, it doesn't just kick out the contract requirement. Like, not only did we need Jane, but we needed Mary, and Mary's in a whole different department doing a whole different job, and her thing's not in the CBA. Well, no, if she's in a position that doesn't specify, if your contract is specific enough to say, let's say only guidance counselors are doing extra days, and now you're pulling a classroom teacher into it, the contract doesn't allow for that. And so it's not going to be considered regular compensation. The other thing that can be a little tricky is you might say, oh, they're here to be, they're required to do up to 10 days. And then we have, guidance counselor Sam, and guidance counselor Sam just happened to work 15 days after the school year. I'm not saying you can't pay Sam for 15 days. I'm saying that you can only take deductions from 10 because that's what the contract sets the limit to. So please, and if it's an up to situation, we're still going to need a letter for the first 10. So, please be mindful. Again, have your contract say what you mean and mean what you say. All right. This pay should be reported in the summer as a stipend because it's not one of the factorials into the base as we're calculating for their creditable service. And that should make sense if you attended the last training session. If you're not quite sure what I mean, please go watch the last training session. It's available on the website, and the calculation is all laid out for you there. Okay. Now, if your contract, I've seen a few of these where it says, oh yeah, not only are they going to do additional days, they are so set. We're going to take their regular salary and we're going to pile on their extra days. We're going to split that by all 26 pays. If your contract says to do that and that it becomes part of the base salary, great. Just make sure that when you're reporting their full-time, full-year salary, you're including the compensation for those additional days, and then you report it all in base, and we're all, even better. Hard to question that it's going to be regular. You've been paying it all year, right? That's like the perfect sort of confirmation that it's regular comp. Now, uniform fixed allocations of extra days are the least likely to be questioned. Right? There are a lot of school districts that put in some great language, like all of our guidance counselors are going to be required to do 10 days, 5 before, 5 days after, right? Now, let's say you have the exact 10 days and, one of your guidance counselors catches the flu or God forbid they get COVID or something. And so they do their days a couple days into July instead of the last 5 days after the school year. That doesn't change the fact that they did their 5 days. We're okay with that. We do understand that the summer for some of these positions is like a really long weekend, right? So the exact calendar day that they do their 5 days on isn't going to be as important as that they did 5 days and they're required to do the 5 days and that the 5 days are in the contract. Okay. So that's going to be the key there. When you have the questionable amounts and we start asking questions like, oh, are they required to do them? And you're like, yeah. It's like, well, what if they don't do them? Well, okay. As soon as you go, well, they're not required, right? And that's where it's going to become not regular compensation. So, again, I'm going to go right back to that point. Say what you mean what you say, right? So make sure you're documenting everything. Take this out. We don't want to be contract evaluators. This is not what we want to do. So please make everything as uniform as possible, structured well. I understand you're trying to take care of your employees. You're trying to fit a need for your kids. We all want that to work, and we all want everyone to get the benefit they've earned. All right. And actually, before we go on to other types of pay, are there any questions on additional days?
We don't have any questions in the chat right now.
Awesome. Okay. So now we're going to talk about coaching in the school lunch breakfast program. In the late 50s, coaching got added to the definition of a teacher. And then like 2 years later, they took it out of the definition of a teacher and they added it to the definition of regular comp. Probably because they were like, oh yeah, it's not a full-time job. So I don't know whose brother was in the legislature in the 50s or whatever, but coaching is like one of the most eligible additional comp things in the whole state. And I say that sort of jokingly because I happen to know somebody whose brother is literally, somebody who's a coach and their brother's in the legislature, or at least used to work for the legislature. So additional comp for coaching in school lunch breakfast program is a little almost misleading because it is so eligible. It's almost hard to get it disqualified. Okay. So coaching is specifically listed in the definition of wages. It is listed as for services in connection with a program of instruction of physical education and athletic contests as authorized by section 47 of chapter 71. Wow. Okay. So coaches are in. All right. Coaching within a school year is specifically determined to be regular comp. So now, while coaching's regular comp, it doesn't mean you can go out crazy and start having, schools take on other schools in July. And all of a sudden, this is going to be retiring eligible, or start running all these athletic camps and calling them coaching. You're not the Patriots. You don't open up training camp in July. Okay. So, coaching is specifically within the school year. Now, you might have all kidding aside, sometimes fall sports might have a couple days before the school year. That's connected to the school year. That's going to be okay. But if you're doing, other kinds of things in the summer, just because it's regular comp doesn't mean that it ignores the school year rule, right? It still applies to summer school restrictions, just like a base pay does. All right. So, having said that, if because coaching specifically in the definition of wages, if you have somebody who's a teacher, so they, you can't coach enough to really be MTRS eligible by itself, right? So you have to be a teacher or an MTRS member of some sort, and they're also working as a coach, then it is always going to be retirement eligible. It doesn't matter how you calculate it. Heck, it doesn't even have to be in the contract, which I know violates the whole first section what I told you. But again, it's in the law, right? So if you have somebody who's coaching, if it's for intramurals, if it's your general sports program, it's always going to be retirement eligible, even if you calculate it hourly. It's one of the few things that works this way. So please know you can't transfer this to other stuff, and you can't call MCAS preparation coaching. It's very specifically defined. Okay. So next, in the definition of wages, there's also very specific language around the federal school lunch program. Now, the federal school lunch program also covers breakfasts. It's not a different program. So if you have breakfast/lunch coverage under the federal school lunch program, payments that you make to teachers for that, if they're doing coverage of some sort, that sort of thing, even if they're not in the CBA, they're going to be regular compensation. Now, these two are the only exceptions, right? And that's because the statute said so. So it overrides any regulations that are out there or any of that. It's very clear the legislature said these two things are going to be retirement eligible. So that's why they're going to be more flexible than other things, even if folks find that a little counterintuitive. All right, so hopefully that makes that part clear. Do we have anything in the chat? Probably not, right?
We do not.
Okay, cool. So now we're going to talk about other additional comp. So this is where things kind of drift into the gray area. The definition of wages provides an overtime exception for schools, which is cool. So you'll see when we're talking about things that aren't eligible, we're going to say overtime's not eligible, overtime in and of itself. That's specifically in the law. But schools get a very specific exception to this. And it says salary paid under the terms of an annual contract for additional services in such school. So please keep in mind, though, even though this is exception, the additional compensation must be in the employment contract. The payment must be identifiable, and it must be fixed or calculated to fixed because it's for salary, right? So salary payable, it's not the kind of thing where it can be hourly and that sort of thing. So we're going to get into some examples of these. So examples of things that are eligible, other eligible additional compensation. So standard longevity payment, right? So, okay, you're going to earn more money based on the fact that not only do you have your master's degree, but you've had your master's degree and you've, been our worker for 15 years, 10 years. Again, a standard longevity payment that's available to all staff that qualify, right? That's going to be in. You could even argue that that's base pay, but now longevity payments, if you do have a clause, they should be in the longevity field when reporting. But if you have a clause that specifically says it becomes part of the base pay, then you have to do the same thing we were talking about for the extra days, right? So incorporate it in the full year full-time salary and then make sure it's part of the base and you're breaking it over all 26 pays. Those clauses are really rare these days, but they do exist. So if they do, make sure you're following your contract. Now, other types of pay, they're going to be eligible, right? So someone's being paid a sick day. You don't have to report anything different for us. So, pay is coming in, somebody on a random Tuesday caught the flu, or whatever the situation is, they're out for a couple days. They're not going to have any fluctuation in pay. There's nothing additional you have to report to us. It's just a paid sick day. It's going to be eligible. Paid used vacation time, same spiel, right? So the superintendent goes out on a week. There's no additional reporting that they're out on vacation. Cost of living adjustments. So cost of living and pay adjustments are going to be regular compensation, right? And as long as it's not like a one-time bonus, and we'll talk about a little bit of that going forward. But if it's a true cost of living adjustment, particularly if it's going to be collective bargaining agreement wide, we definitely saw some of those after COVID, and the federal funding adjustments that were made, and those are regular compensation. Educational incentives that become part of base pay. So if you're going to compensate somebody for any kind of an educational related thing and it becomes part of their base pay, right? That's going to be the key. Not a one-time payment, certainly not reimbursements, but an incentive itself that really builds into their base going forward is going to be okay. And the other key part of that is it has to be going forward. So you can't just say, oh yeah, we're calling it base pay for this 1 year. No. But if they're, going forward, you're saying, hey, you got more education. We see you as being more valuable, and therefore we're going to compensate you at a higher level. That's base pay. We're going to say that's good. All right. Merit pay raises that become part of the base going forward. So this is going to be a differentiation from when it's a base. So here at the MTRS, part of our raises every year is whether or not we did a good job, or at least that our boss thinks so. And so if that becomes part of your raise and then becomes part of your annual salary going forward, absolutely regular compensation. If it's a one-time bonus or you earn a certain payment at the end of the year based on performance, we're not saying that those things aren't eligible or even well thought out. They're just not regular, and they're not regular compensation. So stipends for duties like band director, team debate team coach, mentor, department head. Again, like I mentioned before, you can't have generic names. These are these sorts of things that are going to be fixed in nature. Clubs we see all the time. Yearbook club, all that sort of stuff. They're going to be good to go. We're going to recognize those as regular compensation. Now, some things that are going to be excluded. This list is kind of long. The statute's very specific on kicking some stuff out. So hourly or other non-fixed payments for additional compensation. Things that are like by the class or class coverage is a great example of this. Oh, we had a teacher out, so somebody gave up their study period. We gave them, I don't know, 25, 50 bucks, whatever. And we're not saying you shouldn't do this by all means. But it's just not regularly part of their compensation. Hence, not regular compensation, not pension eligible. Performance bonuses that do not become part of their base, right? So any kind of incentive or whatever that doesn't become part of their base is not going to be right comp. Sick leave payouts, vacation payouts. So this isn't somebody taking a sick day. This is you didn't take any sick days or you didn't over your career. We're going to give you a portion of your accrued sick time as sort of a way of thanking you for not calling out sick. Not retirement eligible. None of this is saying you can't do those things. They're just not retirement eligible. Any other kind of bonus, special projects. I already touched on summer school. Or overtime. Overtime is kind of hard to do in a school because usually you have CBAs and other things are covered, but pure overtime is not retirement eligible. Please keep in mind the statute covers all public employment, so that would apply to, say, police officers, that sort of thing. So other things are going to be excluded. Fringe benefits, such as payment for insurance policies, annuities, or housing allowances. those were specifically excluded by the definition of wages. Cash paid to the member in lieu of health insurance, payments for third-party short-term disability. A lot of folks know the commercials from Aflac. Not telling you can't have Aflac, it's just not pensionable. The paid medical and family leave payments, the PMFLs, anything made out of that fund is also not retirement eligible. Dependent care assistance, tuition reimbursement or bonuses for professional development. So a lot of schools have these great programs where they'll help their teachers continue their education and they cover the cost. All that's fantastic. It just doesn't get factored into retirement, right? You're training them, help them with their value. A lot of times their actual compensation level is going to go up, and that's okay. Like I mentioned, educational incentives that become part of the base are great, but these reimbursements and bonuses and that kind of stuff are not going to be regular comp. Expense reimbursements like allowances for auto mileage, auto allowances, travel allowances, clothing allowances, lodging, cell phone allowances. They're all up. Those are expenses incurred for employment, and they are specifically excluded from retirement eligibility. Workers' compensation wages. So we talked about this a little bit in the CRED service training for workers' compensation. There definitely has been a lot of changes. I know some of you might say, hey, wait a minute, I thought years ago you said this. We did. It turns out we were wrong and the court said so. So if you haven't gone to that training in creditable service, I'm going to please just refer you there. But you should not take deductions. If you have somebody who is on full disability and you're paying them any kind of supplemental pay. If they're on partial disability and you're paying them wages, it's a different standard. If you are confused by that, please see the regular compensation training, the workers' compensation training that we did in the creditable service section, and then I'll happily answer any questions if you feel that your situation's too complicated. Lump sum buyouts for workers' comp, not eligible. Payments for termination or severance, not eligible. Temporary salary augmentations or elbow payments, not eligible. The legislature specifically excluded all of those things. And then sort of a catch-all to this. So you could have some stuff that you've structured in a way that otherwise would make them eligible, but they were done with the knowledge that the person's going to retire. So, it becomes kind of common knowledge. A person's going to retire. They get this other job. Oh, it's part of their base pay. But they only got the job based on the fact that everybody knew they were going to retire. That would be an example of something paid with knowledge of the person retiring. All of a sudden, something gets added to the collective bargaining agreement. Oh, look, it's only added for 1 year, and Barbara just happens to be retiring. If any of that gets traced back to knowledge of retirement, it's going to be out. If you've specifically manipulated contracts, you could get yourself in a little bit of trouble too. So be careful with that. Are there any questions on eligible versus ineligible?
Yeah, Bobby, we do have a number of questions stacking up in the chat. Do you want to take them now?
Yeah, let's go for it.
All right. First question, just to be clear, coaching positions do not have to be listed in the CBA to be eligible for MTRS.
Within the school year, correct.
Great. When teachers provide supervision over a lunchtime, that is retirement eligible?
Yes.
Perfect. If an administrator is on individual contract and the contract allows for additional payment, non-cumulative, if they meet certain goals at the end of the year, this would not be retirement eligible?
It doesn't sound it, because it doesn't sound like it becomes part of their base going forward.
Okay, great. Per the contract, nurses are given the opportunity to work 2 additional registration days at the daily rate. Would that count?
I think we need to see the contract on that and whether or not they're required to. But I would say that sounds awfully specific and we'd want to see your contract, but we'll happily evaluate it for you.
Perfect. A couple more. Our CBA has a stipend for bus monitor, which must be submitted on a timesheet for payroll purposes. Is this pay eligible?
It sounds like it's hourly or incremental, and therefore it's not going to be retirement eligible because it sounds like they get paid per monitoring situation because it's done on a timesheet.
Great. And the last one for now, how are travel and cell phone payments listed in an individual contract?
They're usually listed as a contract, but either way, no matter how it's listed, it's not retirement eligible. So it's probably not something you have to worry too much about. At least not for our purpose.
Great. That's it for now. Thanks so much.
Sure. And just to be clear, when we're talking about the excluded payments, this isn't just because stuff's left out of the contract. The law specifically says expense reimbursements are not retirement eligible. And honestly, I don't think they could have made a clearer case of it if you want to go read the definition of wages. Okay, so pay for working in a secondary employer. So some employees work for 2 or more employers, and a lot of times this is going to be okay, right? So we have a lot of superintendents, for instance, they may cover 3 or 4 different employers. Not an issue, usually. Now, additional pay can get a little squirrely, so let's start out with some of this. So first, the easy one, coach-only employees. If you have somebody who only works in your school as a coach, but you know that they're concurrently MTRS eligible because they're a teacher somewhere else, you are required to have MTRS deductions taken, and you have to report them and register them. If they do not otherwise have an MTRS account, then you don't do this, and you probably, I presume, enroll them in OBRA. But if they are an MTRS member concurrently through another employer, you are required to take MTRS deductions on. You might think to yourself, gosh, how do I figure that out? Well, they're your employee. Check in with them. What do they do full time? They're a coach. They must do something else. I doubt you pay well enough for your coaches that this is the only thing that they do in their life. Okay, so you could also have a situation where you have employees who work like, during the day, they're 60% in one school district, excuse me, 40% in another. Base pay, primary job, good to go, not a problem. Even if each one is less than half time, we talked about this a little bit in the membership eligibility, you can put them together for the half time and they're good to go there too. This becomes a little more complicated if you say have somebody who's a full-time employee in one employer, but the only thing they do in employer number 2 is some sort of secondary, additional services. Something that's not really quantifiable by time or FTE or regular employment situation. But that'll be, they're not regularly employed in this other school district. They're doing an additional duty of some sort. The most dangerous or the most likely scenario where you could find yourself in a position that upsets an employee would be if you have related school districts, right? Let's say you have a regional and a non-regional, and well, let's say, for instance, the non-regional just has more money left in their pool, so you're going to pay a regional employee their stipend out of the non-regional. There's a lot of reasons you shouldn't do this, but they're not going to be retirement eligible because they're not, or particularly if they have different collective bargaining agreements, right? Because the person in District 2, they're not covered by that contract, right? So this is a non-contractual payment to them. If both school districts are covered by the same CBA, you might still be okay because in the secondary employer, they're covered by the same exact contract as the primary employer, so they are a party to that contract, and you might be all right. But if you find yourself in this situation, please reach out. In some cases, you might be better off just having their primary employer, if it's a shared duty, have the primary employer pay them, and then maybe reimburse each other in the back end or something. There's got to be better ways to deal with that. But if you have an employee who's full-time in District A, the only thing they're getting in District B is some sort of additional comp, and they're not a part of that person's collective bargaining agreement, you might be surprised when you find out it's not retirement eligible. So it's definitely something we want to make sure you are aware of and you're careful of. All right. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is that there is a regular compensation cap. So we send a notice about this every year. We generally, a lot of times we'll send it early, but I think we're going to start sending it a little later because it really kicks in later in the year. So, and every year there's a new limit set. And there are sort of 3 groups of people. Anyone whose start date and their continued membership, right? So we talked about this in a prior training, but if you join the MTRS and then you change employers 7 times, right? But you never have a break in membership. So not just a break in service, but you don't refund or I guess retire would be the other option, right? So you still retain your rights even though you switched around from employer to employer. So your MPRS rights go back to when you first joined the MPRS, because again, you've never refunded your account, resetting the clock. Okay. So in that case, if you did that before 1996, there's no earnings limit. In 1996, the legislature passed a law to bring us in compliance with 401A17, and therefore you're subject to the full federal limit, which this year is $345,000. Now, if your first continual membership becomes after January 1st of 2011, then you're only going to be allowed 64% of the $345,000. Okay. So the folks that are subjected to this limit right now, for the most part, we're looking at probably just superintendents, maybe one or two of the business managers. And a lot of those folks are probably still grandfathered into the 1996 rule. Some of them, you know, as folks are retiring and time marches on, are going to start switching over to having a cap, but it's at 345. That's a lot of money. More and more, we'll start to see that, you know, after 2011, populations start to grow a little bit. But most school districts don't have somebody subjected to this cap quite yet. Now, this limit only applies to pensionable earnings. Okay. So, and this is going to be awkward, but it's based on a calendar year, not a school year, because it applies to all public employees. So I know you're probably thinking to yourself, well, that's not how we do stuff. I know, but it's the way the law is written. So unlike the 2% deduction, though, you don't try to average it out in the beginning of the year and take an equal payment the whole time. You basically pay them just as you always would. And when you run into their cap, you just simply stop taking deductions. We are going to ask that you continue to report them on the MPRS report. And a lot of times we'll have you put in a penny just as a deduction so that there can be a record there, because we want them to get their creditable service. They've just met their regular compensation cap for the end of the year. Again, most school districts don't even have this yet. It's not an issue, but it is something I think we'll see growing over time. And again, it's a pretty limited staff. And to be honest, from the folks that I've had to talk to, having to call somebody and say, hey, you make too much money, you know, you're meeting our regular compensation cap, those conversations usually go pretty well. People are pretty happy about making too much money. So, okay. So what we do here is after we get a full calendar year's reports posted, we do an evaluation. Because it can't be used, we can't use salary. So we have to wait for all the deduction reports in a calendar year to be done. We do a cross the system evaluation, and we will contact any member and any employer who has somebody who's gone over the cap. And then that way they'll know going forward, oh, okay, so if this rule applies to Jane, we know that next year when that that limit comes out to us in an email, we have to watch it for Jane. In some of the payroll systems, you can actually enter a cap for the calendar year. So I think the two most common used payroll systems, I'm not going to name them out loud, but if you use them, you probably know who I'm talking about. There's actually a cap that you can set right in the system, and the system will do it for you, which is really cool. And then last but not least, of course, if we have anybody who violates, once we do the verification, they're clearly entitled to a refund of those contributions. So we'll coordinate with you to refund them their overdue compensation. And it's okay that you're going to refund them in a different year than they went over, because it's a change that's allowed under both IRS law and under Chapter 32, where we're returning accidental excess contributions. Okay. So they definitely get the money back. I know particularly where we have a reporting backlog, we might have a couple refunds that are out there that are due, but we're incapable of calculating these amounts until we're sure about the deduction reports that are in. So for anybody who's still working on the 2022 stuff, come on, we got to get those done because we got to do that valuation. So, all right. So with that, that is our last topic for regular compensation for the day. I just, I can't say enough. Thank you for joining us. You're a key part of what we do, whether it's determining eligibility, reporting, understanding reg comp, understanding eligibility, big part of what we do. It got done just in an hour. So, but if there are any questions, please feel free to fire them away.
Hi, Bobby. We don't have any questions in the chat right now.
Wow. All right. We're going to give, I think there's a little bit of a delay. So I just want to give folks just like a minute to beam in any in case they have them. And I like this slide. I've occasionally felt like the young lady in the bottom left-hand corner of this. So we good?
Bobby, we do have one. It's actually a follow-up question.
Sure.
The question that we asked earlier, I think somebody missed the answer to it.
Okay.
Does regularly mean the same number of hours, or can hours differ weekly?
Okay. So the hours thing, it was sort of a combo answer. So base pay, it's not going to matter, right? As long as they have to be regularly employed on a basis of not less than half-time, right? So could they have the exact same number of hours because of a holiday or something along those lines? Maybe, maybe not. If it's additional compensation, we just covered the fact that additional compensation is generally not going to be retirement eligible if it's hourly. So it would be excluded. If it's very specifically additional, so they're already, regularly employed, it's additional compensation for either federal school or lunch program or additional compensation is coaching, then that additional compensation would be eligible. So again, for base pay, they have to be regularly employed. So that almost always means the same number of hours for eligibility. So for additional comp, it would be a question if it's coaching in the school lunch program, then it could fluctuate. Or if it's some sort of other additional compensation, it's probably going to be out because those hours are fluctuating. You're paying it on an hourly basis, and that's, I think, literally the first thing under not eligible.
Great. We've got another new question. When does the final accounting for such things, did we consider excluded payments eligible or vice versa, for example, get determined? At retirement or when the MTRS reviews the monthly deduction report?
Okay, I'll try to do my best to answer this. So I think it depends on when we become aware. So for instance, if we're going through a report, and we're going to cover a little bit of this in deduction reporting, so I'll be a little bit vague and we'll talk specifically how you list stuff, right? But, sometimes we'll see a payment that looks fluctuating, like, it's bouncing all over the place. It could be because we're just randomly researching a member. It could be because we're looking at something in the deduction report itself and it just looks a little odd. If we become aware of it during deduction reporting, then yeah, we're going to raise it with you and say, hey, what's this payment? Why does it look so weird? If we don't become aware until the person applies for retirement, then yeah, it would be dealt with at that point. And then of course, in a situation where it looks regular, but then later on we find out it wasn't, sometimes at retirement's the only time we can really spot that and we see the pattern over time. Hopefully that helps.
Great. Just a couple more.
Yep.
What about if a highly compensated employee came from out of state and we have their start date in 2006, which is seen in the roster? Would their transferred service count toward the max? And how do we find that?
Great question. So if they came from out of state, then their Massachusetts start of service would be 2006. So anything out of state would not count. Even if they may be able to purchase as credible service, but it would not count for their retirement rights within the MTRS. That should be more specific part.
Great, thank you. Sure. Do we have any other questions? Nope, doesn't look like we've got any other questions in the chat at this time.
All right, awesome. Well, I hope folks have found this helpful. And then, if you have questions on some very specific stipends too, I can't say enough. These ones have been generic enough that we've been able to say without the contract language, but I can't say enough. If you have, particularly on proposed language, we tried to ask the staff entirely, do not answer a question unless you have contract language sitting in front of you, because you know, an assumption can lead everybody down the wrong path, and we don't want that, right? It's not good for the member. Certainly, you want to put the employer in a weird position. So please always make sure you're providing contract when you have questions. And then again, I hope this was helpful. And if there's anything we can do to help, please reach out to your employer services rep. Other than that, hope everybody has a great Friday.